Great. So thank you so much. First of all, thank you, Sally and Leslie and everyone in Kabuki, UK, for choosing Manchester to come back after 5 years for this amazing event. That was amazing last time, and I'm sure it will be amazing again today. Hopefully, the next one won't take 5 years, and hopefully. So today, in the morning, we'll give an introduction about the clinical aspects. And in the afternoon, we'll talk about the research aspects. Especially in the afternoon, you'll meet a few students. And for some of them, it's perhaps the first time that they're giving a big presentation, and especially to general audience in a non-scientific necessary environment. So please be kind to them, right? I'm never kind to them, so they need your love. Well, I am kind, so. And also, sometimes when we're talking about medical or scientific terms, if there's anything not clear, please do ask. Also, we try and do it in as sensitive way as possible. But if something is upsetting, just let me know as well, and hopefully we can modify how we put across things next time when we talk. So I'm going to do the easy bit. And then Kate and others will do the more challenging bits. So I'm going to talk about the genetic and clinical aspects of Kabuki syndrome. I hope that most of you are familiar with these aspects because you would have had the diagnosis of the condition or someone in the family with the condition for some time. So hopefully you've had chances to ask these questions, but hopefully it helps to set the scene for following presentations. So just to give a quick introduction as to where we work. So this is University of Manchester, where you're currently sitting, and just down the road is the Manchester University Foundation NHS Trust, which is the hospital. And we're very fortunate that the hospital and the university are just on the same road. So often, half of the day I'll spend here and half of the day here. And it makes a huge difference that you're not on Zoom or Teams talking to real people in person. Makes a huge difference. And that is what translates into positive things for families and patients, I think. I am based at Manchester Centre for Genomic Medicine. So this is a clinical genetics department. It is one of the largest clinical genetics departments in the country. Well, it is the largest in the country and one of the largest in Europe and in world. So we've got about 350 people on the 6th floor. You cannot see the 6th floor, can you here? No. Believe me, there is a 6th floor somewhere there. On the 6th floor of that big hospital. So we literally have access to all kind of scientific expertise and clinical expertise at these two institutes. And one of the major works that we do in clinical genetics is look after people and patients living with rare conditions. And we thought that with all the expertise around, we need to create something that moves things from where they are to the next level and be ambitious. So that's why we created this Manchester Rare Condition Center. It's a virtual center, and it was set up about 2 years ago, and it's developed and grown quite a lot. And we've got a few people from our center here. So can I just maybe ask Rachel to wave, please? Yeah. So Rachel is one of our center research managers, and Eva. So Eva is almost about to be born into this family. So she's going to come and work with us in 10 days' time. And Eva is going to work on research engagement aspects. So sharing information about research with the general public, and she comes from a background of that area. So you're currently working with, is it sickle cell and hemoglobinopathies at our hospital, and doing research engagement and public engagement for that. So she's very experienced, and Eva's we're hoping that a substantial amount of her time will be spent on Kabuki syndrome. So she'll be hopefully creating items and blogs and write-ups in collaboration with Kabuki UK and KSF to share more information about what's happening in the world of Kabuki syndrome. So that's a brief introduction about us in Manchester. And I'll just move on to Kabuki syndrome. So as probably many of you would be aware, that this condition was first identified or described in 1981. So it's almost 43 years now since this condition was known. And it was described in two separate papers, both coming from Japan. And I think it was just coincidental that they were from Japan, because we know that the incidence of Kabuki syndrome doesn't change depending on ethnicity or geography where you're located. So sometimes you will also see that in some old literature, it's called Kuroki-Kawa syndrome, after the two doctors who were the first authors of this paper. I think there's someone trying to get things. And sometimes, again, in older literature, it's also mentioned as Kabuki makeup syndrome as well. But I think more and more nowadays, we just refer to it as Kabuki syndrome. So a really very brief overview, and we'll have opportunity to dive deeper into some of these aspects later on in the presentation, in other presentations. But Kabuki syndrome is characterized by, usually at birth, so most individuals present with poor tone, so being slightly floppy, feeding difficulties, which often require feeding with nasogastric tube, and in at least in first few days and weeks of life. Sometimes the feeding difficulties may resolve, sometimes they continue, and some patients may also need a gastrostomy. So this is the tube for feeding through mouth, and this is the nasogastric tube that I referred to previously. Often around that time, in about 40% of patients, they may have heart anomalies. Palate anomalies are, palate is the roof of the mouth, and urogenital, so that means anomalies of the kidneys. If there are heart anomalies, many of these heart anomalies are self-healing, so you don't necessarily need an operation for that, but in small proportion of patients, a heart operation is also required. Palate problems, sometimes there can be a cleft palate, or sometimes it can be a cleft which is not actually visible, which is basically weakness of the soft tissue of the muscle around the palate. So again, depending on how severe the presentation is, there might be treatments which will be required, but I'm sure that will be covered in one of the subsequent presentations. Kidney problems usually do not need any treatment, and if there is a minor change in the structure of the kidney, then usually doesn't cause any problems, but if it does, then you need monitoring for that. And then in terms of the development, we know that almost 95% or more individuals affected with Kabuki syndrome can have mild to moderate learning difficulties or delay in development, ranging from delay in walking, delay in being able to speak, and so on. But the spectrum is quite wide, so there are individuals who would not be classed as having learning difficulties at one end, and at the other end, there are individuals who may actually have quite severe learning difficulties as well. And sometimes that depends on the exact type of Kabuki syndrome and the genetics of it, and I'll cover that in one of the subsequent slides. In addition to this, as we said, it's a multisystemic problem. So other systems such as the immune systems, so the cells that fight infections, they can also be less efficient in fighting infections. And if you've got immune problems where you're not able to fight infections, in some of those scenarios, you can also develop autoimmune problems. So the antibodies attacking the cells, which normally they should not. But however, that is relatively rare, but that is something to be aware of, especially if you're thinking of if someone has any medical problems and you're not able to really decide as to what the cause for this is. In addition to the immune cells, there might be some hormone issues as well, such as growth hormone deficiency. And again, I think we've got presentation, online presentation about that later on in the session. And a small number of patients can also develop seizures. So that's really a broad overview of the clinical features. Kabuki syndrome is a genetic condition. So a very quick, you are at university, so there will be a biology lesson here. So our bodies are made of cells, and within cells we have DNA. So all the DNA, if you in your cells, could be thought of as a library, and we call that as our genome. But this genome is packaged into what are called chromosomes. So that red or pink structure that you see there, they are the chromosomes, or a cartoon of a chromosome. And you can think of chromosome as a book or several books in the library. And within the chromosome, so chromosome is nothing but it's like a long string of DNA, which is bound on something called histone proteins. And that's important because we will talk about it more in the research section. So all of this DNA is sort of nicely packaged. So it's fascinating in some ways because you got meters and meters long of DNA all squished into cells that you cannot even see. So, and it's not just randomly packed, there is a system, there's an architecture, how all of this is packaged. So if I stretch a chromosome, it would probably be several meters long, and then different sections of this DNA, they are genes. So on every chromosome, there will be hundreds of genes. So for example, there will be a gene here, there will be a gene here, here, and so on. So genes can be thought as those sections of those packages. So you can think of them almost like a page in a book. So library, book, and page. And when we think about genetic changes, you can think of them as spelling changes on those pages. So if I sequence, and we do sequence genomes of people now. So when we met in 2019, that service was just being set up. And now actually in the NHS, we sequence thousands of people's genomes every year. So it is actually quite remarkable. And I think in the UK, we're quite privileged that we've got such an excellent genome medicine service, which probably should be envy of anyone in any other health systems in the world. So if I sequence any of your genomes, we all will have thousands and thousands of changes, right? So those are the little changes which make us different from each other. And however, when we're thinking of identifying the genetic change for someone's medical problems, let us say in this case, you've made a clinical diagnosis of Kabuki syndrome, but you want to prove it or you want to see if that's correct or not. So what you could do is you could sequence the Kabuki gene, but that used to happen maybe 10 years ago. Nowadays, in most cases, the children or the person will have their genome sequenced. And then it's basically, if you think of it as a small library here, all of these as chromosomes. And then this is your one of the page. This is the Kabuki gene page. And you're looking for a spelling mistake here. But then there are thousands and thousands of spelling mistakes everywhere, right? So to be able to work out in an individual as to which change is responsible for their medical condition can be quite challenging. But what it is doing is previously, so when we met maybe 5-7 years ago, the usual method of diagnosis was that you see a patient, you suspect a condition, and then you sequence that particular gene. However, now what we can do is, even if you don't suspect that condition, because you're doing the whole genome sequencing, you're able to identify patients who may not present very typically. So our knowledge about the clinical aspects of Kabuki syndrome have grown enormously, because there are so many patients who don't present typically. 10 years ago, there was no chance that you could have made a diagnosis in them. So all of this is relevant, and the reason I'm kind of giving all this background is that what we thought Kabuki syndrome is 30 years ago or 40 years ago, when those papers from Japan came out, from what we know now, just from a clinical side of things, is hugely advanced and quite different as well. So we've talked about the background of genetics. So coming on to what is the genetic basis of Kabuki syndrome. So in vast majority of patients, in 70% of patients approximately, the condition is caused by change in a gene called KMT2D. In the older papers, sometimes this gene was referred to as MLL2. So we avoid the word MLL2 now, and there are reasons for that, but without going into them, if we just stick to KMT2D, that's the most important gene for Kabuki syndrome. And usually, the genetic change for Kabuki syndrome in KMT2D occurs for the first time in the individual who is affected. So either in the end of the sperm or very early on after fertilization, there is a change that occurs in one of the copies of KMT2D. So all of us have two copies of KMT2D, one from our mom, one from our dad, and Kabuki syndrome can occur only if there's a change in one copy. So as far as we know, there's no one who has a change in both copies of KMT2D. However, once the genetic change has occurred, when that person makes their egg or sperm, they'll either pass on a copy without the change or copy with the change. So in every pregnancy that they or their partner will have, there will be a 50-50 chance of them passing on the KMT2D genetic change to their children. So that's the most common type of Kabuki syndrome, but I'm sure that several of you would have heard of Kabuki syndrome type 2 as well. So this is a rarer type of Kabuki syndrome, which affects probably initially we thought 5%, but as I explained, with whole genome sequencing, now we know that actually there probably more than 5% is probably closer to 10% patients who have Kabuki syndrome due to KDM6A changes, which is also called Kabuki syndrome type 2, and it is an X-linked condition. So that's a bit different from the Kabuki syndrome type 1, where I said it's 50-50 and it doesn't really matter whether you're a boy or a girl. However, the KDM6A gene is located on the X chromosome. An X chromosome is special. So women have two X chromosomes and men have one X and one Y chromosome. And because the gene is located on X chromosome, boys, if there is a change in KDM6A, so this sort of blue pair is representing a boy. So this is a boy with X chromosome and a Y chromosome, and this is his dad, so with X chromosome and a Y chromosome. So if a boy has KDM6A change, there is no second X chromosome to in some way compensate for this particular genetic change. Whereas if a girl has in the genetic change, there is that second X chromosome that can to some extent compensate. So the X-linked Kabuki syndrome is usually milder in girls and more severe in boys. And when we go on to the research section in the afternoon, I've got a couple of slides that explains this clinical difference in Kabuki syndrome type 2 in a bit more detail as well. Then there's been further advancements since we last met. So there are lots of changes that we know that they would definitely cause Kabuki syndrome. So genetic changes where you're sure that it will lead to the diagnosis. There are lots of changes that we know don't cause Kabuki syndrome. So I'm sure if I sequence the Kabuki genes in if people are not affected, still you're going to find several hundred genetic changes even just in this room. However, there's something in between where we don't have enough information to be able to decide whether this genetic change will cause Kabuki syndrome or will not cause Kabuki syndrome. So you can do all the sequencing, you get the result, but you're still not able to interpret or correlate that with an individual. So again, this has all come up in last 5 years or so. What we have realized is that anyone who has a Kabuki syndrome change in their cells, in their DNA, that change actually leads to subtle differences in the whole of the genome. And the way we describe this is changes in the methylation of DNA. But without kind of going into too many technical aspects of it, we now have approaches, technology, and knowledge to be able to study those changes. And that becomes a really useful diagnostic tool because you can study these tiny subtle changes all across their genome. And if you've got a genetic change and you're not able to decide whether that individual has Kabuki syndrome or not, you can then study these changes. And if their changes are similar to how they are in other patients with Kabuki syndrome, you can say, yes, that is a Kabuki syndrome causing genetic change, or that genetic change is just a private change in the family and it doesn't really lead to Kabuki syndrome. So this is a fairly new advanced test. So this is called DNA methylation signature for Kabuki syndrome. But why am I talking about this at this forum? It's because we find sometimes, of course, that you've been given a diagnosis of Kabuki syndrome probably, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And sometimes those diagnoses might not be 100% accurate. So if there are doubts about the diagnosis, then perhaps this might be an approach to confirm that diagnosis or rule out that diagnosis, which might be useful in terms of thinking about the clinical management and treatment and inheritance, etc. for that particular individual. So this DNA methylation signature is now available, and we performed this test in Manchester, and I think it was about 6 months ago or so, we got approval for making it available for any patient in England, and by extension it can be for other countries in the UK as well. But right now it's funded for any patient in England through one of our, and again, this is something that's been established just a couple of months ago, which is NHS England Genomics Network of Excellence for Rare Disease, which is again, so this is being provided from Manchester. So I hope I'm not sort of out of time as such. So I just wanted to, because all of this, which we've talked about and what we will talk about in the afternoon, is a result of lots and lots of people's work, and we will talk about them later on in the afternoon. But 4 people I wanted to thank. So Professor Diane Donai, so she was a clinical geneticist in Manchester, and a long time before I came to Manchester, she started the original research cohort for Kabuki syndrome in early 2000s or late 90s. So she was really a pioneer, and it was really working with her that I got interested in doing more research in Kabuki syndrome. Amy and Elizabeth, they were 2 genetic counselors who, when we initially set up the Kabuki syndrome clinic in Manchester, they worked with me. And Dan Weisberg is a neuropsychologist. Again, he's now left Manchester, but he was really pivotal in us setting up the Kabuki syndrome clinic. Some of the initial work that we did defined the genetic basis of Kabuki syndrome. I've not talked about all of this, but But I mean, hopefully in coffee, etc., if there are any, I'm very happy to take them. Some of this contributed to development of the international consensus diagnostic criteria for Kabuki syndrome. And a lot of this work was supported by Scales family who had a child with this condition, and they're from Manchester, and they've been incredibly helpful. So I just wanted to thank these people, and hopefully this sets the scene for next presentations. Thank you.